Thank you, Lisa, for such a stimulating talk as your talk was yesterday, and it's bringing up so many interesting questions and provoking so much stimulation vis-a-vis my project. But we've talked a lot here about cultural industries and creative societies, and actually in thinking about your call for experimental critical methods and methodology that's in dynamic relationship to your own field work in these disparate areas, I think that it's actually very informative and a part of a new movement in the new humanities, which is the third part of this seminar that nobody's really been talking about. And that's the part that actually drew me to come to the seminar because, well, I didn't know that much about creative societies and cultural industries, but mostly there are these new methods that are critically being engaged in various fields. And for example, the visualizations that you've produced of these footprints, to me, I think are one of the most effective means of trying to assess the critical methods that you're talking about in terms of both the call for creating new histories and new theories through your footprints. So that's something that's really fantastic, and I'd love to ask you more questions about it. But my question actually has to do with, maybe we can go back to some of the images if it's at all possible. So the footprint that you first showed with the kind of circular, kind of concentric going out, I understood as a visualization of the wireless data in some area. I'm not quite sure exactly what geographical area it was, but then and then the footprint of the wireless services in the center of Ulaanbaatar and some of the peripheral areas in Mongolia. These are two very different visualizations of your method, and so you talk about how you're someone who's very familiar with satellite. Reading satellites, looking at satellites and reading wireless connections, or I don't know, the range of wireless connectivity, and that's how you create these visualizations. But to me, I don't quite understand how footprints function in that visualization that you showed. So for example, you said that they're effective to show us that there are supra and subnational implications in the cultural atmospherics that it creates. So if that's the case, then can you discuss a little bit about those supra and subnational? Because I work with visualizations of my archive, and what it shows is that the nation is very strong, contrary to my hypotheses. And so I'd like to hear a little bit more about this idea of what the function of the footprints do in vis-a-vis your critical methods.
I think I'm not trying to suggest that the nation state is not important, or especially when it comes to the regulation of signal flow, which the nation state is always trying to do with telecommunication and broadcasting. What I'm interested in is the footprint as a zone in which signal circulation is possible, and if that's possible, capital flow is possible, and different forms of development, economic development, from natural resource development to the formation of creative industries is possible. Because what these dots represent are, these are areas where those little pink dots are locations in Mongolia where Mobicom has established wireless service. And so there are different towers installed within the zones of those dots that ensure that if you're a subscriber to Mobicom, or if you use one of these phones on the street, you'll have access to service. So, I mean, in some ways, my research, it's like a conceptual move. I'm trying to imagine myself as not just operating within a national territory, but within a signal field, within a signal territory. And in some cases, these territories, yeah, there are operators who are licensed. There are wireless and satellite companies that may be licensed to operate and offer services within nation states. But sometimes those services exceed the boundaries of nation states, and they create transnational possibilities. of language and translation. In the post-war footprints piece, I tried to discuss at the very end the way that after the war in Yugoslavia, there was a huge migration out of the country. And there have been patterns of displacement and migration out of Yugoslavia since World War II and even before. But what the new satellite operators do, they buy time on satellites to shadow and follow those displaced populations to places like Australia and California, so that the signals can be relayed via satellite and land in a footprint on another planet. So I just think there's a lot of thinking to be done about the way that footprints are functioning in terms of the control of communication and finance in certain regions, but also in terms of this age of globalization where we've got more immigration possibly than ever, and more forms of mobility than ever. I'm not sure that answers. I mean, so since Mongolia's population is really dispersed into these different areas, you're going to see a wireless footprint map that looks like this. And I've got tons of these maps on my machine. I can show you Turkey's. Turkey's is almost entirely covered. So that means that multiple wireless service providers have installed towers and ensure that there's going to be coverage across the country. But their coverage might also move into northern Iraq because the Turkish military is staging maneuvers and operations in northern Iraq. So those footprints may not be bound by nation-state boundaries. And we need analytical models that recognize the materialities of signal distributions, of infrastructure developments that don't always respect the sovereignty of nation-states. In the history of the media in the U.S., the history emerges as about border blaster radio between the U.S.-Mexico border and between the U.S. and Canada. There were all kinds of questions about how to regulate and control the signal in relation to the sovereignty of the nation-state boundary. I don't know if that directly answers your question, but if you want to talk more one-on-one about this, we can.
Okay. So my question is actually very similar in that I'm interested in some of the parallels and relationships that you're drawing between the footprint and the nation-state. I like this idea of the footprint because it intersects with my own work about thinking about territories differently. And I wanted to ask for some further clarification about something that you said about looking at the history of footprints and trying to map out a history of the footprint. And it's easy for me to think about the histories of nations and why the borders of nations might change, but what does a history of a footprint look like, and what are the conditions for changing footprints?
Okay, this is a great dissertation project. No, but I mean, really, it involves, looking at the history of telecommunication and broadcasting and coverage zones. That a tower has a depending on the height of the tower, you've got a certain type of range of transmission and coverage and service. And so it involves just like looking at these maps, looking at footprint maps, and trying to find, there are media atlases that provide these kinds of maps of coverage. Let me give you a specific example. When I did this research for this article called Where the Cable Ends, the way that I started is I got a map. These are expensive maps to sometimes get. But this is a map of all the cable service providers in the state of California. And so you see the state of California, and it's color-coded according to all of the companies that offer cable TV services across the whole state. And so I looked at the way that those zones were mapped, and then I found the areas where they ended. And I physically went into those areas to see what it's like. I mean, I'm just, maybe a lot of people wouldn't be interested in this, but I wanted to know, what is it like where the cable ends? Does another system pick up? Is this a so-called site off the grid? And what I ended up discovering is that satellites really pick up where the cable ends off. So in the desert, what you see is people who have cable TV service, and then the cable system ends, their infrastructure, their grid ends. Adelphia is the company that I was looking at. And then on the other side of that, you've got people with huge dishes. They were the first users of satellite television in the United States in the 1980s. These huge dishes they were basically intercepting signals that were going to the cable providers. So it's really about, trying to get your hands on these maps, and that's why I should have added to that list. I said that we need to move into an area where we intersect more with environmental studies and geography. It might mean spending some time in some cartography archives and finding these old maps. I have a student right now, we have a student at UCSB, a PhD student, doing some research on underwater cables, transoceanic cables that were the predecessors to satellites. So instead of being out in orbit, they're underwater and carrying. There are lots of stories about this, and there are maps of those cable systems that exist. Once you look at those maps, you get a sense of the patterns of distribution of signals, and you can start to think more about relational economies and how maybe trade routes of communication were developing in relation to trade routes for other kinds of natural resources, for instance.
I just had, I wanted to thank you very much. I loved your talk, and I thought it really illuminated something, or put into dialogue with some of the other material we've been looking at and some of the discourse around creative industries, which tends to fetishize the digital as almost like some kind of talisman or something of, of potential and whatever, and also presumes access to all kinds of digital technology, which is obviously really unevenly kind of distributed. And anyway, so I just, I thought it really highlighted that, and the kind of, ingenious and kind of, I guess, almost low-tech uses of satellite technology were really striking there. And I just had a question. I was wondering, I know nothing about, I'd be really interested to know about how film and TV, the kind of distributive networks of film and TV in Mongolia, and I was just wondering if you could tell me something about that.
Yes. In the longer chapter, I have a whole thing, not just about, I focus mostly on wireless. Like, if you have these wireless footprints, what's happening within them? What form does the infrastructure take? That's really what I was focusing on. But in the longer version, I do have a whole discussion of satellite television in Mongolia. And there are actually workers, they're called the Malchin, which is the Mongolian word for cowboy, actually, who are the ones who, it's the name of a manufacturer of satellite dishes that are used out in the remote areas where the cable infrastructure can't stretch all the way across. You saw that map. In the Soviet Union, in these vast parts of Central Asia, you can't, it's too huge a project to string cable, and usually that cable would be strung for telephone or television or something like this only if there was a military purpose or a gold mine or something. So you have a model of television in Mongolia that's very different also from in the West, where, let's see if I can, so I won't go through this at length, but let me see if I can just do this. Looking at some of the footprints that extend, these are now satellite footprints, not just wireless coverage zones, but some of the satellites that can be used to downlink signals into this region. And then I try to study also what kind of practices are happening in terms of satellite television in this area. And visited, the station and met with the people who work with and distribute signals in this footprint, and try to look a little bit at the historical development of these systems in the region. And it developed, of course, with the major support of the Soviet Union. So I went into areas like this and tried to do, here's this Malchin dish, right? And so this is what the marketing for it looks like, where these are the guys who kind of go out and help teach people how to install these dishes and systems in the GARE. These are also systems, it's kind of almost like the macro lab I was talking about. Many of them are solar and wind powered because they're off of electrical grids as well. So you have, this is at the so-called black market in Ulaanbaatar, where they sell these solar panels to fuel television in remote areas in Mongolia. And then you have, gears with these big dishes, and a lot of times you'll also see a solar panel like this, where television is fueled by the wind and the sun in parts of Mongolia. So it's about like reimagining television not as this thing that we just sort of always take for granted as being so homogeneous when it's been globalized around the world, but really taking seriously the way that these technologies that may have been developed in the West get localized and used and reinvented. And from this, the person who's crucial in this regard is Eric Michael's book that I already mentioned, The Bad Aboriginal Art. Looks at Australian Aboriginals and reinvention of what television was. And that book really influenced me. And so trying to find ways of tracing out the differences of what this machinery is, if that answers the question. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. The question I have relates to the relationship between the worker and the company. And maybe you can comment a little bit more about that relationship. At least I might have missed it, and I got here a little bit late. But you said, for example, that they were paid very little money. Right? And, so I want to know, what does it take? Not that I'm looking for another job, but what does it take what is the not a contract, but what is the how do these people get one of the phones? What's the responsibility if they break the phone? Are they controlled? Are their hours controlled? Are they completely freelance? We saw this the beads workers in the factories, and one would think, well, those are exploited workers. Are these exploited workers? I mean, what is that? Can you make more detail on those on that relationship, please?
Yeah, these questions are really good. This is something in the longer version I go into greater depth. But I'm trying, as I said in the conclusion, I'm trying to think about these workers somewhere between, a kind of situation of pretty serious poverty and some kind of situation of autonomy. I mean, in the sense that the way that it works is that each of these workers has to have either purchased one of these phones and has pays a monthly fee to use them, or is a subscriber and is sort of leasing the phone and pays a monthly fee for the calls, right? After that, it is up to the discretion of these workers as to where they go in relation to the companies themselves, okay? But the situation is much more complicated than that, because there are turf wars for certain spots of the city where the volume of traffic is really high. Some of those who started operating right away have ended up kind of asserting their claims to certain areas, and they negotiate informal deals, say with a restaurant owner that kind of has control over this particular part of a block. So there are, in addition to the relationship between the company and these phone workers, which is somewhat informal. I mean, when I interviewed the people who work for Mobicom, they just said, yeah, there's about 17,000 of these workers, and we don't have a lot of supervision over them. As long as they pay their monthly bills, we're basically happy. And so what I'm getting at here is that, as your question implies, the working situation is complex and needs to be detailed and described at greater length, and I will end up doing that when I publish this. And there's a version of where it's longer, and I kind of go into that in greater depth. So I appreciate the question. I should add one more thing to it. It's also that this can be a family business. So let's say somebody who's usually out there gets sick. Sometimes the daughter will go and sit with the phone, or if somebody has a doctor's appointment, they can ask somebody else in a neighbor to come and sit there. and then give them a percentage of the earnings. It's just a really informal economy. It's a street economy that has this organic life of its own, and it's, the more I looked into it, the more difficult it became to describe. But I think the fact that it's so complex means that it's its own art form in a sense. I mean, I need to do more descriptive work in trying to explain how all this works, and I just haven't gotten to that point in terms of presenting it publicly yet. So, yeah.
Lisa,
Yes.
I detected a tension, a productive one, but perhaps even a contradiction in two strands of your talk. On the one hand, the claim about footprint analysis, which you started by saying is deterritorializing and above and beyond literally the nation. And yet, then the analysis of the culture that is originated by the use of the cell phone is very strongly dependent upon national characteristics of Mongolia.
Yeah.
So that at the same time, you're suggesting that your level of analysis is beyond the nation and it's actually mapping out other territories. So it's deterritorializing and reterritorializing. But most of the comments then are dependent upon the specific history and the very specific history, and you went in great detail and very convincingly about how its national characteristics that are like poverty and horse culture and telegraphy through horses that are an isolation and a particular infrastructural level of development that are then producing these results. So I'm interested in that tension along the lines of 3 points. One, why is it that this, because I know in Colombia, for example, the same thing happens, but people actually rent regular cell phones, like the ones you use or I use.
Yeah. They're doing that now, too, in Mongolia. They just
So
started.
I wonder about the materiality of that device, which is like a big chunk of a cell phone that it looks like a regular phone. Why? Second, how is it that you have avoided what would seem from where I stand like the obvious vocabulary? And you're very convincing at using not this vocabulary but yours, which is the vocabulary of cultural hybridization and localization of globalizing processes.
Yeah.
And let me see if I remember the third one. I don't. Maybe while you're talking, I remember it.
Well, about your first, I keep getting stuck on this electric tape here. The first question, this point about, the multi-tiered, or the contradiction inherent in the broader analysis between wanting to situate the work within a trans or subnational footprint and then a focus in the description on national characteristics. That contradiction doesn't really bother me in the sense that that seems to be the way that, our kind of descriptive work has to get at that contradiction rather than pretend that it doesn't exist. I mean, maybe what I need to do more is bring out the ownership issues as well, in the sense that, the Japanese are co-owners of this footprint, and that, thinking through that further. But I kind of wanted to have like a multi-tiered analysis, and the contradictions of it aren't so disconcerting to me, but, I will think through that further. On the materiality of the cell phone itself, I think what's going to happen is this practice is probably going to disappear altogether within the next 2 years, if not sooner, because mobile phones are now cheaper and more readily available, and they're, at the same time as this industry has emerged, there's a thriving mobile phone repair industry and mobile phone manufacturing industry. That's a street practice, really. Where people just take their phone and they need a new SIM card and they put it in and somebody adjusts the speaker or something. They're incredibly talented machinists. And so I think, but one of the benefits of this thing being larger is it's a security and livelihood issue, so that they actually, some of them put these locks and chains on top of them, and they think if it's larger, they can keep their eye on it, and it's not as easy to run and take off and steal. And so a lot of them actually want to make sure that they keep these bigger phones in good running condition, because it's easier for them to make sure there's no theft. And then the other point, how have I avoided the critical language of cultural hybridization? I guess I haven't directly dealt with it. I'm familiar with the literature. I probably just haven't woven it into the work yet.
The reason I asked that is because I remember the third point, and the third point is nothing of, and I wonder, I mean, maybe it's not necessary to say anything about it, but I, as a literature person and as a text-oriented person, was struck by this.
Yeah.
You said nothing about the content of the communication that
Yeah.
those cell phone calls are about.
Yeah.
And if those are completely radically utilitarian, or love conversations are had, you know.
Yeah, this is an issue that has come up when I've presented this work before, and I go back and forth on it because, on the one hand, my interest is not, I mean, it's a tough question, and it reminds me of Raymond Williams' work on, you know, content and technology and content and form, and the idea that the utterances and expressive aspects of media technologies are actually part of their technological form, right? That you shouldn't really separate those things off. But I have to say that, I mean, there are different obstacles. There are language obstacles for me, personally as a researcher, although I could hire a translator I could transcribe conversations and have a translator translate them. That's a possibility. But there are also privacy issues, and I don't know if I'm that interested in having a huge archive of a bunch of telephone conversations made on the street. And I don't know, I mean, maybe that would really add to the analysis and enrich it a lot. But I'm more kind of interested in just this physical arrangement of the infrastructure and its kind of literal embodied form. I'm someone who was really influenced as a grad student by the work of Haraway and thinking about technologies as embodied. And this just seemed, this seems a real kind of literalization of the cyborg culture. And although a lot of people have refined Haraway's ideas, I'm somebody who has spent a lot of time thinking about the social construction of technologies. And so that's primarily where my research interests lie. And I don't necessarily think I have the credentials that an anthropologist who would be an ethnographer would have to do really detailed analysis of Mongolian telephone conversations. Maybe if I were Lana Rakow, does anybody know her work? She might do it. I don't know. So I appreciate the question, but sometimes you get a question that points out your own limitations. So
just a quick footnote on the phone.
Yeah.
I used to have one of those in 1996, and two things: the battery lasts much longer than any regular cell phone. Number one.
yeah,
And
it's true.
the signal is much better than well, used to be much better than the regular cell phone. So that probably is
Yeah.
another reason why they're so big.
Yeah, it's more like phone as hardware rather than fashion accessory. But another thing I forgot in this version that I didn't go into, which is related to the economies that form around and in relation to mobile telephony, is that these workers not only sell time on the street, they also sell a lot of cash and carry items that range from, we don't think of eggs necessarily as cash and carry items, but you may have seen one woman who's selling some eggs next to her phone, and then a lot of them sell cigarettes by the cigarette, not a whole pack, but just like one cigarette or a stick of Wrigley's gum. So they sell cigarettes, gum, little packets of coffee, and sometimes eggs, sometimes other cash and carry items. And there's, in some families, a division of labor where one person will go and set up shop on the street to sell time, and a couple of the kids will go and pick up supplies for the gum and cigarettes and stuff. I mean, so and this is in a country with 2 million people. This is 17,000 workers. It's a substantial, small kind of industry that's emerged. So let's see what happens with it. I don't know if it will sustain itself.
To what extent is this practice recognized by the Mongolian government as like generating capital and taxes?
Yeah, this is a good question. Yeah, the question was, to what extent is this practice recognized by the Mongolian government as generating capital or enhancing the flow of capital?
Doing something to, calling it a developing country is part of development, they just need to change.
Yeah, I have a feeling it will get more regulated eventually, but it's really unregulated right now. And it's not something where there's been a lot of government intervention. I mean, the main things that are happening around it are really informal, where there will be struggles over space. And I think I did hear discussions when I was there last year that there may have to be permits issued to mediate debates over territory on certain streets and maybe like allocate time to certain people. But I have a feeling the government's thinking of this as a transitional economy that has emerged and that will be faded out as most people and most families end up getting their own cell phones. So.
I think Steve's.
Yeah, I just want to join the chorus of people applauding this work and telling you how much I appreciate what you're doing. And as a media studies person, the way you're kind of really blowing up the media studies, some of the media studies paradigms of the past is really terrific. And connecting with the last couple questions, it seems to me that you are demonstrating for us directions of the new humanities in the way that you are bringing together policy, technical expertise. You're talking with bureaucrats, you're talking with company officials, you're talking with people who are the leaders of these telecom organizations, and alongside of it, you're doing ethnography. And that's just extremely exciting, but also extremely challenging. And this probably touches a little bit on the last couple questions, which is, the government obviously envisions these technologies in certain ways. The telephone companies obviously envision these technologies in certain ways. But then when you get to ethnography, you're spending time talking with Mongol families about this, and I'm sure that there's a certain rub or tension you feel as you try to weave these different narratives together. There's an epistemological tension that's unavoidable. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, how you narrativize these disparate threads. And obviously, if your experience with this is anything like my experience with it, you're going to have people telling you very different stories about their experiences with technologies and their visions for these technologies that contradict one another. And so what do you do with those contradictions? Again, how do you tell stories about this? How do you make sense of it as a scholar who's bringing these very diverse ways of knowing together?
Can you finish the book for me? No.
Fair to ask that at 5:30.
No, that's a fantastic question, and I think it does go back to the question that Juan raised about, how to deal with, these contradictions and tensions that emerge in the act of writing and trying to make sense of the materials that you gather and the different interests that are embedded in all of the materials that you gather and the people whom you have talked to and the institutions that they represent. And putting that into a coherent form is always the biggest challenge. I mean, and so I guess the question is, in the humanities, are there ways that we can do that differently or better, or I don't know, but I kind of feel like the way that I was trained, you try to soak as much up from these different interests as you can and try to make sense of them. And I mean, I try to, in work, you know, situate myself too as an outsider, and I don't know how to answer that question. Do you? Does anybody else want to say? I think it's
raises the question of content to form in relation to humanistic scholarship and, in the end, representation. So the question becomes, I mean, in your instance, I mean, how are you thinking about the way in which the material you've presented to us here, which includes image, you kind of gestured at sound, but then there wasn't sound. but in the end, right, when you're thinking about a formal presentation of the work, you know, I won't preempt by saying between book covers because it might not be there. How do you think about the relation of form to content in a complex, layered, overdetermined structure of a range of content in a way that does that enables the possibility of voices both in their own terms and through your own voice? I mean, so it becomes overdetermined in that sense too. And what are the technological forms that you might be thinking about in relation to all of that, as humanistic self-representation morphs into other possibilities?
Yeah, I think a lot about, especially having opportunities to present this stuff as art installations. I try to use those experiences to think about writing too, and how to layer voices and material gathered and what is the best form in the end to present it. And I have thought about that. You know, I want to present this so that the footprints are there, the images are there. It would be great if the conversations of the Mongolian phone conversations were there in the final work. But, you know, there's some experiment in publishing with books. And some books have been published with CDs and things like this. I haven't thought through that yet, but it's a question I need to think through as I'm trying to structure the book and finish it up. So you guys are asking challenging questions that I don't have detailed answers to, I'm afraid. Or maybe somebody's research like Nicole, who's thinking about textuality and voice, and I need to read her dissertation first before finishing this. I don't know, does anybody want to respond to David's question or point? Or do you want to say anything, Toby?
I think could you pass the mic 2 down, but then it should definitely go back because you've been incredibly pleased.
I just wanted to say that I think that this issue around contradictory perceptions that you encounter when you do field work and then also archival work and then your own analysis, your interpretive work on the particular objects and materials that you're dealing with in the field, and you come up with all this stuff that can't possibly, be, internally coherent or necessarily even in harmony. It's just all this dissonance, and a lot of people that have been working in memory studies and oral history have addressed this issue in particular, and I'd like to recommend the work of Alessandro Portelli on this, because what becomes a really interesting question and a way to sort of address the contradictions without resolving them is to look at the possible reasons for those contradictions, to allow them to stand, and then to think about what work those contradictions and different perspectives are doing. So that was just one thing that I know of from my area of expertise.
I guess my, thanks for the presentation, by the way. It's so thought-provoking. I think that, I guess my main question is about the kind of tension between a metaphorical or figurative use of both footprints and also communications and the kind of very literal and situated kind of work that you're presenting. And I had a specific question about something that you said about this practice of mobile telephony as a reconfiguration of nomadic pastoral lifestyle, or a reconfiguration of a nomadic lifestyle in the space of or in an urban space. And I wanted to know if you could kind of link that kind of conclusion, or is the nomad operating as more of a figure, or is this like, saying something specific about a certain ethnographic representation of Mongolians or something like that, So I was wondering if you could say more about why that, or what kind of work that kind of reading does in relation to the larger project.
Is this on? Okay. This is definitely something I'm thinking through really carefully, because on the one hand, this is happening literally and historically, in the sense that people who were working in the countryside with herds of animals who died, many of them had to migrate to the city and looked for work. And you probably saw some of the photographs with people wearing the deal, the traditional Mongolian costume. Most of those people lived in the countryside and were working with animals at one point or another and have migrated to the city. Not to say that urban, people who have lived in Mongolia for years don't wear that same costume. But so that's one issue, is that it's a kind of economic reality. I don't, and that's what I'm primarily interested in. I'm not trying to essentialize Mongolians as fundamentally nomadic, although historically they certainly have been. I read some, I've been reading literature kind of by anthropologists, historians, sociologists about Mongolians, but I don't want to overextend the kinds of claims that I'm making about this urban mobility and their historical pastoral nomadism. That's why I invoke it in the conclusion as just a speculative kind of thought rather than a claim.
Okay, thanks. I really appreciate that you highlight the very material and embodied perspective of the whole digital economy. And I got the impression that your footprint map is very much connected to this material approach, but it's somehow not connected to your analysis of the different narratives and the informal economy of the people working as mobile phone operators. And I wonder whether you intend to create the connection in the future to extend your footprint with some kind of different narratives that you gain from your research, or whether you want to have these as two distinct narratives within your research.
So, as I understand your question, you're talking about the visual form of the footprint map as being insufficient to the kind of critical analysis that I ultimately want to participate in. Is that,
not insufficient, but it's not reflecting all the dimensions of your
Yeah.
research. So how it's very connected to the material aspect of the digital communication, but it's not resembling the other aspects.
Yeah. In some sense, it's like I see the map as a starting point that's sort of insufficient in the sense that cartography, conventional forms of cartography, cannot keep up with the speed and the flows of the digital age. My real fantasy of a map is a map that shows all the signals in circulation in the electromagnetic spectrum in maybe like 3 seconds around the world, and what that would look like. To imagine media not just as framed, narrative, textual forms, but atmospherically as signals as signal fogs. I mean, if you look at the discourse and language of nanotechnology, this is the kind of language they're using. They're talking about utility fogs and blobs of, you know, data that can be reformed into different entities and things like this. So I think what you're pointing out is that in terms of trying to visualize signal flow and signal coverage as dynamic fields of activity, these maps definitely are insufficient. And so maybe what you're getting at and leading me into is that in future practice with trying to think through this in art practice, I can try to figure out what kind of visualizations might be more appropriate to the kind of critical project that I'm trying to get at. So I appreciate the question.
Thank you very much for giving us a very detailed description of how this system of wandering mobile phones work in the Mongolian situation. But I was wondering, what kind of cultural effect did this system actually produce on the Mongolian society? I mean, I think you spend most of your time describing the situation, but how does it actually impact on the Mongolian society? That's something that I'm interested in knowing. Mm-hmm. That's the first question. And second is a sort of follow-up on the point, maybe a minor one, a point you brought up when you were answering the question of why you have avoided the vocabulary of hybridity. You said something to the effect that you were fascinated by this phenomenon because these Mongolians look like cyborgs to you, because you were.
That's not what that's not why I became interested in the research project. I just want to clarify that.
Okay, but you said something like that, right? That they look like cyborgs.
I didn't say they look like cyborgs. I said I'm interested in cyborg theories of Donna Haraway, and that this instance seemed to literalize that.
Right. Okay. Well, I think it doesn't matter what kind of rhetoric you use, but what I'm saying is that are they more like cyborgs than, or I mean, more like instances of cyborgs than us who are carrying mobile phones around? I mean, why is it specifically? Why are they, or this instance more specifically cyborgian than us, who are using mobile phones all the time, carrying mobile phones?
I don't think I made any claim that Mongolians are more cyborgs than any people around the world who use cell phones at all. I don't mean to imply that at all, and if that's what you took, I would hope to clarify that I did not.
Well,
say that.
Yeah, that's what really mystified me, because when you said that, I think you mentioned that in response to the question of, not using vocabulary hybridity, and so I think you used that as a cyborgian practice as an instance of hybridity.
Yeah,
right?
I guess if the issue is that the work is not adequately theorized in the language of the work, it's maybe related to the fact that I tried to internalize analysis in description in some ways, rather than to have a whole section of theory tagged on where I make a proclamation about this as a transformative act. And one of the reasons for that is I'm trying to resist technological determinism and claims that the use of the technology in this way necessarily radically transformed or revolutionized a society that I'm also, my competency in is limited. So I analyze this as an example of a kind of technology in transition. It's almost like a twilight of technological use that I am resisting making broad proclamations about the impacts. So I guess it's a way of trying to answer these two lurking issues that have been coming up. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to get that thought out before I forgot it. So did you want to keep going with your question? Okay. I might be getting a little tired too. So.
It's almost time for Lisa to have a drink.
A strong one. Does anyone else have any?
Oh, there are many more.
I would like it to be
there.
more that you all are talking too. If you guys want to say things, like the questions don't have to be directed at me. Maybe other things came up earlier in relation to your own introductions. Sure.
No, hold on. We've actually got people in line,
Sorry.
Lisa, if you don't mind. We've been waiting very patiently.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'll make this really quick. You mentioned how the phone workers sort of travel based on the traffic patterns of the city and move according to sort of the density of whether they're next to a market or a workspace, something like that. But I'm wondering to what extent the reverse happens, where the phone workers are sort of influencing the built space of the environment, and how sort of new maps of population density or physical space have sort of emerged because of the concentration of the workers, and if you can speak to that just a little bit.
Yeah, your question reminds me of one of my favorite essays, Walking in the City by Desserteau, and thinking about the way that workers and people moving through urban spaces help to shape and produce and reproduce or alter that space. I think it would be interesting. The way that I do my research when I'm there is to really spend long hours sitting and watching and following and taking notes and asking questions, but a lot of my time is just, sitting and watching and seeing who comes and where. And it seems that it's important to think about this activity in relation to, for instance, I'll just give one example. There's a state department store, so this is the department store that's owned by the Mongolian national government, and it's where they have a grocery store as well as all kinds of other goods. And around that store, there's always, people coming to shop, but always a whole kind of armada of white phone workers. And people will come in and out of the store to make phone calls and go back in, or be going home, and maybe they can't carry everything, so they call someone. So I don't know if this is answering your question, but just thinking about how the very presence of these workers in certain areas has modified or relates to the use of space and commerce and those kinds of things. Do you want to follow up? Because I'm not sure I actually answered you.
That was pretty much what I was asking about, just whether or not there has been any sort of new built environment because of the presence of these workers.
Yeah. Okay, let me say this another thing. There are these telephone stands. So the way that the built environment has changed is that there are, I didn't show this image, but there are some areas where it's not really the built environment, it's kind of like the makeshift environment. But there's an area where a lot of the workers lock up their little stands for the night. So there's, instead of like a bicycle rack, you've got a walking phone worker stand, and all of the stands are locked up. Things like that have popped up. Or there are also kiosks where those who have rented them over time have those white phones inside these kiosks where they can heat them and stay warm in the winter months, and they also sell newspapers and magazines. So there's almost like a hierarchy of spatial relations too, where some people are able to be enclosed, some people have stands, some people actually just move and carry it in their own hands. Or I saw one guy, he made like almost what looked like a cigar case for his phone, and just walking around to kind of take the pressure off the back or something. So
one last question from Bill, and then it's time to hit the spot.
It's a pretty easy question, and it's mainly speculative, pointing to where your research could go.
Okay.
And I like the idea that you were looking at the social construction of technology rather than just depending on like an idea of technological determinism. But it seems like you're discussing at least 3 kinds of technology, and you're treating them very differently.
Mhm.
The mobile phones, the satellite towers, and the maps. And I just wonder what would happen if you thought about doing an ethnography of the map makers that you treat in the same way as doing an ethnography of doing the mobile phones, and with the people who what does it mean to interview the people who actually build the satellite towers, and how would that influence your work?
Yeah.
So just questions like that are popping up in my head about your work.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that, yeah, I'm thinking about mobile phones, the kind of handheld receiver, right? And I'm also so that's the end point, the kind of material object of the wireless footprint that's used. And then I'm looking at television sets as well, which are and dishes hooked up to television sets, which are the end point for the satellite footprint. These are 2 different kinds of infrastructures that are overlaid, over the same spaces. So I'm looking at receivers, the network infrastructures, and then the maps that show where the coverage is. And then the particular embodied uses and arrangements that I see as extensions of and parts of the infrastructures. Can you restate the last part of what you said? Because it seems like it got some chuckles, but I was thinking about the first point, and I want to make sure I
said that you're
remember it.
using 3 technology.
Yeah.
You're discussing
but
3
the part
technologies.
about cartography and interviewing.
Oh, I said, what would it be? What would it mean to treat the maps in the same way that you're treating the mobile phones? In other words, doing an ethnography of the people who use the maps, which would sort of be a self-ethnography.
Yeah.
Because it seems like you're treating those different technologies in very different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also reminded of the people in Union Square in New York who offer to charge people's cell phones for money.
A lot of times those maps are used to let people know, to let consumers know where they can get coverage or not. So they're almost like corporate promotional documents. And they have much more detailed technical proprietary maps that they often won't hand out to you. I've tried to get some of them, and they want to charge you a lot. But I mean, I could be more aggressive about getting those. But yeah, no, thank you for the.
Thank you for the project.
You know Jonathan Stern's work?
Yes.
Of course. I thought about that.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.